So Rémy is an expert in the political discourse of 18th century Britain and has published on figures such as Price, Priestley and Spence. He's interested in the connections with mainland Europe, and today he's going to explore the reception of Price in France, Netherlands and elsewhere. He's from Université, Bordeaux-Montaigne, but today I believe he joins us. Is it from Rome, Rémy? Remind me where you are.
Yes, Rome indeed.
Lovely. And can you share your slides with us again? Is that possible? Lovely. Perfect.
Thanks. I'm absolutely honored and delighted to be part of this conference, a well-deserved one for the 300th anniversary of Price's birth. I'd like in this paper to examine Price's reception in mainland Europe. This is not an altogether new topic. There are valuable studies of Price's French contacts, for instance. However, the influence of Richard Price has largely been studied within an Atlantic framework directed towards the British Isles, the American colonies, and the fledgling United States, with France and the Netherlands playing perhaps a more peripheral part. This paper presents some research perspectives. It is too early to offer firm conclusions because Price's reception in France, the United Provinces, Germany, let alone Italy or the Hispanic world, is not completely mapped. I've worked on Price's reception in France, recovering some letters and examining how the French revolutionaries made use of his name and reputation. I've mainly focused on Price's discourse on the love of our country and on his political pamphlets of the American War, so the observations, the additional observations, though not so much the observations on the importance of the American Revolution. Of course, there must be a story to tell about the reception of Price's brand of theology and moral politics. At least I found evidence in revolutionary France of mentions of Price and Priestley as true philosophers who were wise enough to debate benevolently without arguing, you know, like in an enlightened, candid way, agreeing on not agreeing. So in addition to my own limited published work in this field, I've also started to locate pamphlets and journals pertaining to Price in continental Europe. But I must say from the start that any attempt at exhaustivity should involve several specialists, probably a team of specialists from the various countries involved. So Price's European reception has been partially charted, but much remains to be done. I am persuaded that the English rational dissenters, Price of course, but also his French Joseph Priestley and other figures, including women gravitating in dissenting circles like Helen Marie Williams and Mary Wollstonecraft, the world of radical dissent, made an impact on the intellectual life of France, the United Provinces, Germany, and perhaps elsewhere. A study of the European reception of the English rational dissenters would be a worthwhile addition to the field of intellectual history. Price would inevitably loom large in such a story, but the prosopography, the comparison with other figures, would also help us evaluate Price's stature by placing him in other contexts. As a Frenchman based in French academia and teaching in British studies, so I teach basically British history to Francophone students, I must have a perspective that differs from those of Wales-based or UK-based scholars. So from a French perspective, that of an Anglicist straggling the fields of English studies and history, my perception is that Price has been studied in a variety of paradigms which often overlap, each approach illuminating aspects of his work and reception, but also often obscuring others, such like French Revolution studies, Atlantic studies, cultural reception studies, British radicalism, for instance. For several decades, British and American historians have noted Price's transatlantic links in the framework of the American Revolution. This is so well established that I need only remind you of Price's contacts with American clergymen and founding fathers like Franklin, Jefferson, Adams, Washington, and others like James Witherspoon, John Witherspoon, for instance. The paradigm of Atlantic studies has been very strong. I can simply quote the title of a book by Chris Williams, published in Cardiff in 1991, Richard Price and the Atlantic Revolution. On the other hand, other links have been under-researched, at least as far as I know. For instance, Price's relations with thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment. The Atlantic paradigm has served to highlight many contacts in France, the debates with Turgot on the American Constitution in particular. However, I'd like to depart from this paradigm and I would offer a kind of counter-Brexit move, because I think Price's reception is political, even for us in the 21st century. In a kind of counter-Brexit move, I'd like to connect Price and the English dissenters back with continental Europe, looking eastwards, not westwards. There is another paradigm, a very strong one in countries like France, Germany, or Italy, the Republic of Letters, in which Price could be studied. The originally Franco-German paradigm of cultural transfer, Kulturtransfer, transfer culturel, can also be mobilized. It involves paying attention to cultural intermediaries, passing one discourse on to another country, and translators, publishers, editors, and so on and so forth. For all that, looking eastwards does not mean discarding the Atlantic paradigm for several reasons. Of course, it's difficult to wrench Price away from an Atlantic context, given that he wrote major political pamphlets to support the American Revolution, and that's why Europeans knew him for. A rather recent book, Slavery Hinterland, Transatlantic Slavery and Continental Europe, extends the Atlantic paradigm to hinterlands, showing that debates on slavery penetrated mainland Europe as far as Prussia, Vienna, Prague, or the Baltic states. There are many tantalizing international connections to be traced, and this can be done when specialists of different areas meet and share ideas. So I'd like to start with an extreme example that's not been really researched into. For instance, specialists of Diderot, French and Japanese specialists of Diderot, told me that extracts from Price's observations on civil liberty were inserted into the Histoire des deux Indes, the history of the two Indies, by the Abbé Raynal. So the history of the two Indies, nominally by Raynal, is in fact a patchwork, a kind of palimpsest, a collective enterprise. And we know that Diderot was the one who included material by Price into the multi-author history. This history, in turn, and this was unearthed by Germanist specialists in the Baltic area, this history inspired Garlieb Merkel, a little-known figure, a Germanophone Aufklärer, who was based in Riga, and in his work, Die Letten, which is arguably the foremost book of the Latvian Aufklärung, if there is such a thing. It's a book that used Raynal's and Rousseau's theory to argue for the abolition of Leibeigenschaft, or serfdom, the system whereby peasants were the property of lords in Prussia and Eastern Europe. So in other words, the anti-colonial discourse of Western Atlantic countries, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, morphed into a critique of serfdom and feudalism in the eastern reaches of German-speaking Europe. A careful research of Merkel's Letten would probably show Price as an intertext in a layer of text beneath Rénal. And I've given you, I've shown you the cover of the book with this, with the title, of course, Rénal, Herr der Märkte, Transformationen der Antikolonialismusdebatte in der europäischen Aufklärung. So, of course, such an understanding, such an undertaking takes, a specialist of the Enlightenment that would be fluent in German, French, and English. Myself, in fact, I could do that, and I'm probably going to show how Price's influence extended eastwards towards present-day Estonia on the border of the Russian Empire and St. Petersburg. So this extreme example of an indirect reception in Letland bears some characteristics which I think are shared by other examples of cultural transfer and adaptations of Price in continental Europe, namely the cultural intermediaries, in our case, Merkel, and probably the German translator of Price's observations. The cultural intermediaries adapted Price to the specific political and rhetorical necessities of their context of reception, in this case, the Duchy of Courland, then part of Russia. So it means, of course, that the study of Price's reception in continental Europe ought to be carried out by specialists of those European countries, which involves linguistic knowledge, of course, but also the mastery of the political context and local idioms. Secondly, Price's thought probably nurtured a lot of European thought, even if it was unacknowledged, and often through complex transnational mediations, through Diderot, through Rénal. They must be privileged channels, but there must be others. Why not Turgot? Why not other French? Why not also Dutch, Huguenot, Francophone journalists, this kind of people. Thirdly, one should look for particular nodes in the network, particular groups of intellectuals, like the Bowood Circle in England, the Rénal Diderot set in Paris, and areas and cities. I suspect Holland would be such a node with its network of Calvinist clergymen, some of which corresponded with Price, with its Huguenot refugees and publishers of French language gazettes. Paris also, of course, during the War of American Independence and the French Revolution. Research on Price's reception is today greatly facilitated by the availability of studies of such intellectual networks. Tracing Price's international reception is also rendered easier thanks to the digitization of vast masses of newspaper. Full text searching enables a research to find out critical reviews of Price's work in a range of periodicals, even if you do not really master the language. A few words on Price's French reception. One aspect of Price's French reception that's been well covered by historians is the epistolary exchanges with Turgot in 1778. Turgot opposed the British bicameral model of Lords and Commons and proposed a unicameral blueprint instead for the young American Republic, because the unity of the nation should prevail over any subordinate, separate, or private interests. John Adams paid homage to Turgot and used those exchanges in his own reflection on American institutions, raising issues about the private or public nature of those exchanges. Will Slaughter's expression, constructive misreadings, which he uses in the title of a 2011 article on this topic, constructive misreadings is, I think, a good characterization of this triangular exchange. Besides that, there are, of course, studies of the Bowood Circle, cultural intermediaries like André Morellet, who transmitted ideas mooted by Price priests and their friends, in the Shelburne/Lansdowne circle to French salons and Parisian printers. I have also published a modest article in a book entitled Mémoires de la Révolution Française. It's a large collection of essays edited by Professor Anne de Matin about many aspects of the memory of the French Revolution. So I was telling you, Price can be caught up in many different paradigms, and this time this is the paradigm of the memory of the French Revolution. So I suggested that in 1790, 1791, the consecutive death of Franklin, Price, and Mirabeau led to a brief moment of joint commemoration of leaders of the French and American revolutions, Price playing the role of the English patriot, paying homage to the English Constitution. Price appeared as the wise man, the victim of a cabal led by Burke, Pitt, and the aristocracy. This was a very special moment when the French revolutionaries wanted to maintain peace with England and needed to mediate ideological tensions because it became ever more obvious that Pitt and his cabinet were turning against the revolution. Price, who had been involved in an extensive correspondence with French Jacobin clubs, served this purpose admirably. His discourse on the love of our country, translated by two different translators in France, which is in itself interesting. So Price served the Jacobins' peace diplomacy admirably in that particular juncture. But this moment was, of course, transient, and Price was quickly forgotten as the English became the national enemies in 1792, 1793, the onset of the war, and so on. 19th century French historians made only fleeting references to Price, most of them rather disparagingly, saying that he'd been refuted by Burke once and for all, with the interesting and quite telling exceptions of Jules Michelet, the Romantic prophet historian, and Jean Jaurès, the socialist leader, who both believed in the reconciliation of the peoples and both harked back to the hallowed moment in 1790 when Price's irenic project of world peace seemed to be within reach. Thus, Price's memory faded out in France quite quickly, except in some left-wing intellectual socialist circles that were very limited. Price was also largely forgotten in Victorian Britain before a revival by intellectual historians and Welsh historians in the second half of the 20th century, as you know. So this is, in short, the arc of Price's reputation in France as I see it. But this is not the end of the story, because I think there is material related to Price and his friends of the Revolution Society that is still to be recovered in French repositories of archives. In particular, the Archives départementales. So as you know, France has been divided into départements since the revolution, and the Archives départementales hold the papers of the local Jacobin clubs. So some city archives and some Archives départementales hold material from the French Jacobin societies, the Amis de la Constitution. I found a smoking gun in Aix-en-Provence, which I wanted to share with you. It was a letter shared by the Revolution Society to the Société des Amis de la Constitution d'Aix. It was published in Britain, but interestingly, the letter bore the seal of the society. This is, as far as I know, the only example of the Revolution Societies there, probably Britannia. The letter also deserves attention because a member of the French Society penned a translation saying that he would deface the original. So this reveals tantalizingly little, but it still reveals something, I guess, about translation practices and the way the letters were received and were used as objects, not just as, ideology. So perhaps French repositories of archive might be the new frontier for Price, for revolutionary Price studies. In the United Provinces, I'm not going to detail all countries, obviously, but in the United Provinces, prices influence was probably at its highest during the Batavian Revolution. Intellectual historians and specialists of the people like Weiger, Velema, Annie Jourdan, Jonathan Israel, and others, all showed that prices and prices pamphlets were translated and distributed by Dutch Republican patriots and equally criticized by Orangists. Price's observations and Priestley's pamphlets were part of the patriot arsenal. But you also had indirect stuff. For instance, this criticism, this review of Josiah Tucker's treatise concerning civil government, which is a refutation of Price, which was published in the Algemene Bibliothek. Forget my Dutch accent, but you can see Amsterdam 1777. So this was reviewed and criticized quite quickly. And you can see, even if you don't know any Dutch, you can spot Locke, Priestley, and Price in italics. And bürgerliche Regering means, of course, bourgeois or civil government. So you see that there was a Dutch debate on citizenship through reviews. The main promoter of Price's work was Johan Dirk van der Capellen, a front-ranking leader of the Patriots, who had Price's observations and additional observations translated. He wrote several letters to Price explaining that he has used these principles, in particular the people's right to remodel their government, to justify the 1772 revolution in Amsterdam. So influence here, of course, is a misleading term because there was a two-way relation between Price and Dutch patriotic republicanism. If you remember well, there's a couple of allusions to the 16th century independence war of the Dutch against the Spaniards in Price's observations. And of course, Van der Capellen picked on that and used it back into the Dutch context to make his local, national points. Van der Capellen, there are 2 or 3 letters between Van der Capellen and Price, which are recorded in the masterly edition of Price's correspondence. In those letters, among other points of interest, Van der Capellen says that he did not reprint the financial annexes because the Dutch merchants had read them in the original English and the figures were already out of date. This, by the way, should alert us to one possibility, the possibility that Price's works on finance, which presented Britain's situation as catastrophic, on the verge of bankruptcy, were a practical contribution to the American cause. This financial contribution might have been as important, if not more important, practically in Britain's downfall than Price's ideology. People were interested in Price's calculations. So Price's reception in the Dutch Republic quite quickly. You can see Velema and Klein, who quote Price among other luminaries, Anglo-Irish, American luminaries, Priestley, Paine, Gordon and Trenchard, Locke, Hume, Hutcheson, etc. This, of course, suggests the relevance of a study of the reception of the rational dissent, not just Price, but also Priestley and the others. Okay, there was also all the French publicists of Huguenot descent. This is one example from Le Politique Hollandais, which I cannot really detail, but a French language interpretation of Price's essay on the population of England, published in a French language Gazette in Amsterdam. Now coming to Germany very quickly, just one point, just one quick point. Prefaces and footnotes are key sites where translators explain their motivation and present Price's work to a foreign audience. So any study of Price's reception in Germany must identify and track the translators. So you have a number of such translations, people like Christoph Daniel Ebeling, who edited the Amerikanische Bibliothek, publishing many pamphlets by Price. I'd like just to focus on a translator's note on the word empire. This is quite a long German quote, but I would simply I'd simply like to say that basically the translator says the English call their state the British Empire, Imperium Kaisertum. In the translation, I wanted to use the Roman expression Imperium, preferably to the German one Kaisertum, because we associate with Kaisertum various collateral concepts which cannot apply to the British state, especially because we always think of an emperor, a Kaiser, in relation to Kaisertum, whereas an Imperium can be ruled not by such a head of state, but by a common senate, just as, for instance, the Roman Imperium was ruled. So I have not studied the history of conceptions of empire in the wake of the American Revolution in German context, but it seems probable that the German translations of Price's observations are valuable contributions to those debates. At least the translation in this footnote bears signs of shifts of meaning in the Anglo-American world with implications for Germany, where the Holy Roman Empire offered another model of empire, Kaisertum. So it would be great, of course, for an intellectual historian to spell out the meanings of Kaisertum and of the expression Gemeinschaftlicher Senat, which for me is very obscure and challenges my own skills in German translation. So by way of conclusion, I would suggest that Price may well have been a more significant thinker in some European contexts than we think, perhaps in Germany. Translations of Price's political pamphlets and reactions to them have been generally located, though not much commented. The Hispanic world remains a blank as far as I can tell, but it was recently contacted by graduate student, a PhD candidate from Colombia, Carlos Martinez, who tells me there's something to do about Price's influence on the thought of Simón Bolívar and others. So rather than discussing the fidelity to Price or the deformations inflicted on his thought, it would be fruitful to explore the political uses. French historians would say les usages politiques. So les usages politiques to which Price's thought was somehow adapted. Yet Price was not alone. When the Dutch, the American, or the French revolutionaries extolled him, it was as part of a pantheon comprising other defenders of liberty. The one task ahead of us would be to situate Price in the various me back to my earlier proposal, that of the European reception of the English rational dissenters. Thanks for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rémy, for that sweeping presentation and taking us across mainland Europe and telling us of the reception of Price, and certainly something there towards the end in terms of his reception in Germany that overlaps with some of the discussion in Carl's presentation. And yeah, a wonderful tidbit to finish with, the possibility that Price may have had an influence in Latin America. Do we have any questions for Rémy, either here in the room, or I'll just pop to have a look at our virtual audience to see if there are any hands being put up there. Nobody online. Oh, Carl, sorry, Carl. Do unmute yourself, Carl, and please come in and ask Rémy.
Thanks very much for all that. I'm just till anyone else has something more substantive, but I very much appreciate this. The reference to miracle, I'll have to follow up. I have a background kind of from Riga too, so this new volume. But if I understood you correctly, it does seem to me that I was under the impression that Price and others were familiar people. There were people in Germany who knew the translations and so forth, but I could never find a direct connection either with Kant or even with people extremely close to Kant. If you ever find one, let me know, because you know, they were. It's very bizarre because Königsberg, people talk about, oh, remote Königsberg and all that. That's totally wrong. Königsberg was an extremely cosmopolitan place, one of the biggest and best connected cities in Europe, really, in German lands, and Kant was in constant communication with people, you know, visitors coming through town and trying to find everything good about everything. So it's just curious that it never appears, but if you see something even kind of almost a connection, direct connection.
Oh no, yes.
Or if you have any thoughts on why someone like up in Königsberg wouldn't be paying attention to this big phenomenon, because people say, well, they were all obsessed by the French Revolution, but that was much later. My question is the 70s and the Dutch situation, as you know, the Dutch, John Adams mentions this, the Dutch were directly inspired by the Americans, and many of them were. And the intervention, which defeated in the 1780s, that defeated the Dutch patriots, the people that came in were the Prussians. And the Prussian government, in fact, also had very close relations with the American government. They're making treaties and all sorts of deals going on. So if you were kind of keeping up with Prussian affairs, you'd be thinking a lot about America. And yet we have this blind spot in Königsberg. I don't know if you have any thoughts on what's going on, especially the Riga and miracle and all that.
Yes, I'd like to make perhaps a historiographical comment on that. I came to know Merkel because I was part of an EU funded program called Medienpraktiken der Aufklärung, something that was based on the Baltic states and that tried to connect the Baltic states with mainland, mainly German, the German Aufklärung. And I was the only specialist of Britain in the team, and I realized that all the colleagues were meshing a kind of net between Germany, lots of university cities in Germany, and Königsberg and Riga, but there was nothing on Britain. And I realized that there's a kind of disconnection, because when you look at the historiography of connections between England, Scotland, and the Baltic, you have collections like the Northern World at Brill, which traces connections between the Jacobites, between timber merchants, fur merchants, lots of people, you know, Scottish exiles and settlers in Poland, in Courland, in lots of places, with an emphasis on migration, demography, and economics. Then we know of a few intellectual connections, like we know that Kant read Hume, because of course he mentioned Hume and the metaphysical slumber and all of that. So we know that Kant read Hume, but I never found any evidence of where Kant found his edition of Hume, how the books were shipped and transported. So as far as I know, so there's no study of a kind of intellectual link between like the Scottish Enlightenment, the dissenters, and Königsberg and Riga. So this remains to be done. So there's this strange disconnect that some types of connections are very well studied, like the Jacobite diaspora, and others, such like intellectual history, are not really dealt with. That's my impression of the historiography. But I've relied mainly on English language historiography. But even when you look at the work of German scholars like Hans-Jürgen Lüsebrink, Professor Tataka in in Tartu and people like that, they usually connect Riga and the Baltic states with Germany and France, but never with England, as if there's a kind of separation. But I think it's a matter of different groups, different specialists who work in different departments that don't communicate with each other. I think it's partly that.
In philosophy, there's a pretty connection in the sense that Hamann was very close to Kant, and Hamann spent time in England. Jacobi wrote a book on Hume.
Okay.
On it to Jacobi, so there was and Kant knew his Hume not through English but through translations of people like Hamann was working on. So
thank you.
They were, and you'll see Herder knows about that too. Herder was
Herder.
He was a real, so in the world there's on that, but there's still no price connection.
No, not yet.
Circle, but there's a lot in philosophy. And a lot of Scottish German connections, I think.
Sorry, Rémy, I had more of a comment, although, can you hear me? I never quite, yeah. Can you hear me? It's Marion again. So as a German who's lived in Great Britain for 30 years and works on the French Revolution in Wales, I understand your approach and your pain. And Marianne and I, we've both recently been involved with a project on radical translations and bookseller networks and so on. And it's quite striking that it was a cooperation between London and France and Italy, and it focused on the networks on those three countries. And I was invited as a kind of outlier, Wales, and there was somebody from Denmark there who had been invited as well and who talked about enlightenment in an absolutist country. So it persists, this disconnect, doesn't it? And I wonder whether, I'm still wondering where that comes from, and whether it is based on kind of bookseller networks, and these things have to be investigated, but also people, as you say, not communicating in different departments. But I wanted to ask something else about the 1770s, and if you look at Riga, if you looked at Prussia up there, of course you can ask yourself, why are they not more concerned with the American Revolution? Well, they are a little bit concerned with Russia and with Catherine, and with the threats and the movements that are coming from further east, all around them. So I'm not all that surprised they're not philosophically all that concerned about the American Revolution. So I don't know, am I completely wrong there?
No, I agree with you. And yes, I know about the Radical Translation Project, King's College London. It's a great project, but indeed it's based on Italy, France, and Britain. I suppose it's a question of people, academic networks, probably. Yes, I would totally understand that. Intellectuals in Eastern Europe would be less concerned with prices take on the American Revolution, because the influence of the American Revolution would be very indirect on them. But I thought one way perhaps of benchmarking prices influence would be to compare it with Paine's. And honestly, Paine was a very good self-publicist, while Price was, as you all know, very modest and very diffident about his own achievements. So Price boosted his own claims. He said that every man, woman, and child in the American colonies had read Common Sense and that kind of thing. But I think that if we look at the journals, the gelehrten Zeitschriften, that kind of paper that you can find in any university city in German. I suppose that price would be much more discussed than Priestley. But then the question would be, did that percolate down to the plebs? I think this might be limited to a kind of elite, a kind of academic elite. So, but of course, it would take a specialist of Germany to look at that.
So just to say thank you once again, diolch fawr iawn for everyone's contribution, and look forward to seeing as many of you as possible tomorrow morning at 9:30 again. Thank you very much. Diolch fawr.